8 of them. 8 of the best minds money could buy, huddled like nervous pigeons around a monument to their own failure. They wore expensive, ill-fitting suits, their ties loosened, their faces slick with the sweat of multi-million-dollar panic. The air in the server room, usually a sterile, Arctic hum, was thick with the stench of burnt ozone, stale coffee, and the cloying sweetness of pure, uncut fear. Julian Croft watched them from the doorway, his own reflection a ghost in the reinforced glass. He saw the tight set of his jaw, the exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes. He was a man accustomed to control, to bending the world to his will through sheer force of personality and the crushing weight of his fortune. Today, the world was not bending. It was breaking. Anything, he asked. The word was a shard of ice in the hot, frantic room. Marcus Thorne, his chief technology officer and the self-proclaimed leader of this flock of useless experts, flinched. He turned, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. "We're running advanced diagnostics, Julian. It's a cascade failure in the primary data array. The redundancy protocols, they aren't kicking in. It's like the data isn't just corrupted, it's gone." "Gone is not an option, Marcus," Croft said, his voice dangerously quiet. He didn't yell. He didn't throw things. His anger was a far more terrifying thing, a drop in temperature, a sudden stillness that promised annihilation. That server holds the final logistics for the Horizon merger. The entire deal is predicated on that data. The signing is at 9 a.m. tomorrow. You have until then to get it back. Marcus swallowed, the sound loud in the tense silence. "We're doing everything we can. We've brought in specialists from Oracle, from an elite cybersecurity firm in Tel Aviv. These are the best people on the planet." Croft's eyes swept over the best people on the planet. One was frantically typing code that scrolled meaninglessly up a screen. Another was on the phone, his voice a high-pitched whine of excuses. 2 more were arguing in hushed, furious tones over a complex schematic that might as well have been a map to a city that had already burned to the ground. They were useless. All of them. His gaze drifted past them, past the blinking red lights that dotted the server racks like a fatal rash, and landed on a figure in the far corner of the room. A ghost of a different sort. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was the antithesis of the frantic energy consuming his experts. She wore a drab gray uniform, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her shoes, he noted with a flicker of detached observation, were worn at the heels, the rubber squeaking faintly on the polished concrete floor with each methodical pass of her vacuum cleaner. The maid. He couldn't remember her name. He wasn't even sure he'd ever seen her face clearly. She was part of the building's ecosystem, as invisible and as necessary as the air conditioning or the plumbing. She emptied his trash can every night, leaving behind the faint, clean scent of bleach and ammonia. She was a function, not a person. Her name was Ilara. And she was listening. The whine of her vacuum was a low, constant hum, a baseline of normalcy against the rising tide of hysteria. But beneath the noise, her mind was anything but normal. It was a place of quiet, ordered chambers, of catalogued facts and cross-referenced observations. A library of the world she moved through. She wasn't supposed to be in the server room. Agnes, the head of housekeeping, had been explicit. "They're in a tizzy up on the 44th floor, love. Steer clear. Men with expensive suits and cheap manners." But the call had come from Mr. Croft's own assistant. A spill. Coffee, black, on the floor near the main console. A potential slipping hazard. So Ilara had come, with her bucket and her mop and her industrial-grade vacuum. She had cleaned the spill, her movements economical and precise. And then she had started her usual vacuuming routine, a task she performed with the same meticulous attention to detail she applied to everything. It was a comfort, the familiar grid pattern she followed across the floor. A way of imposing order on a small patch of a chaotic world. But her real focus wasn't the floor. It was the room. It was the sounds. The frantic, useless clicking of keyboards. The high-pitched, intermittent squeal from a cooling fan in Rack 7. The low, almost subliminal thrum of a power conduit that felt wrong. A vibration that resonated not in the ears, but in the soles of her worn-out shoes. It was the smells. The burnt sugar scent of an overheating capacitor. The sharp, metallic tang of ozone. The faint, almost undetectable scent of cheap paper from a discarded user manual, its pages warped by moisture. It was the sights. The way the dust motes danced in the beams of the overhead lights, settling in a peculiar pattern on top of the server racks. Heavier on the left side of rack 7. Thinner on the right. An anomaly. A clue. In her pocket, her fingers found the folded, creased edge of a piece of paper. Not a schematic, not a line of code. It was a letter from the hospital. A final notice. Her younger brother, Leo, needed a series of experimental injections to halt the progression of his muscular dystrophy. The cost was astronomical. The kind of money that Julian Croft probably had in the pocket of the suit he'd worn yesterday. For her, it was a mountain. An unclimbable, terrifying mountain. Next to that letter was another. The eviction notice. Her rent was 2 months past due. The landlord, a man with a sour face and no patience, had given her until the end of the week. This job was all she had. This invisible, thankless, back-breaking work was the only thing standing between her and the street. Between Leo and the final, irreversible decline. So she kept her head down. She pushed her vacuum. She remained invisible. But she watched. And she listened. And she thought. The 8 experts were baffled. They spoke in a language of acronyms and jargon, a verbal smokescreen to hide their own incompetence. The RAID controller is non-responsive. Have you tried a cold boot of the entire array? We did. It just throws a kernel panic and cycles. It's like the bootloader can't find the primary partition, but the partition is there. I can see it when I mount it externally, but it's gibberish. Ilara paused her vacuum, tilting her head slightly. The high-pitched squeal from rack 7 came again. Not constant. It was a pattern. 2 short squeals, a pause, then a longer one. Morse code. S-O-S. No, that was fanciful. Her mind, once trained to find order in the sprawling chaos of historical archives, was always looking for patterns. She had been a librarian once, an archivist in a university library, before the budget cuts and her mother's illness had devoured her savings and her career, forcing her into this world of gray uniforms and silent service. She knew how information was stored, how it was organized, and how, sometimes, it was lost. Not because it was deleted, but because the system for finding it had broken down. The card catalog was burned, but the books were still on the shelves. She looked at the men. They were staring at the screen, at the digital ghost. They weren't looking at the machine itself. She pushed her vacuum along the wall, her path taking her closer to the back of the server racks. The air was warmer here. The low, dissonant hum was louder. She ran her hand along the smooth, cool metal of a side panel on rack 6. Then rack 8. Cool. She reached rack 7. The panel was warm. Not just warm. Hot. Hot enough to be concerning. She knelt, pretending to spot a piece of lint on the floor, and looked at the base of the rack. She saw the main power cable. And she saw something else. A faint, dark stain on the concrete beneath it, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It looked like sugar. Crystallized. Like someone had spilled a soda here weeks ago and it hadn't been cleaned up properly. A sticky, almost imperceptible residue. She remembered the coffee spill from earlier. Mr. Croft's assistant had been specific. Near the main console, that was 20 feet away. This was something else. The high-pitched squeal happened again. Squeak squeak. Squeak. Her eyes followed the lines. The heat. The dust. The sound. The stain. They were all connected. They were all telling a story. A story these 8 experts, staring at their screens, couldn't read. Croft stalked back into the room, his patience worn down to a single, fraying thread. Report, he bit out. Marcus wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. We're trying to rebuild the index from a backup. But the last full backup was a week ago. Even if we get it working, you'll lose 7 days of critical data. Unacceptable, Croft stated flatly. The merger data was finalized 3 days ago. 7 days is a lifetime. You are telling me that a $10 billion corporation is going to be brought to its knees because you forgot to check the backups. The backups run automatically. Something interrupted the process, Marcus said, his voice rising in panic. He was looking for someone to blame. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the schematic they'd been arguing over. The schematics we have are out of date. The last hardware upgrade isn't properly documented. Ilara saw the schematic from across the room. It was lying on a spare console, weighted down by a cold cup of coffee. One of the experts had been using it as a coaster. There was a brown ring obscuring a section of the diagram. The section that detailed the power distribution for Rack 7. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of failure. She needed this job. She needed to be invisible. Speaking up was a risk she couldn't afford. But Leo's face swam in her vision. The quiet hope in his eyes every time she visited. The trust. She pushed her vacuum to the corner and switched it off. The sudden silence was deafening. Every head in the room turned towards her. 8 pairs of irritated, confused eyes. And 1 pair of cold, gray eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. Julian Croft stared. For the first time, he was seeing her. The lines of exhaustion on her face, the intelligence in her dark, watchful eyes. The contrast between the simple, worn uniform and the complex intensity of her gaze. She felt a hot flush of panic. What was she doing? They would fire her. They would laugh at her. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice dripping with condescension. Can we help you? Or are you finished making all that racket? Ilara's own voice came out as a whisper, barely audible. The paper. She pointed a trembling finger at the schematic. The coffee cup. One of the junior techs, a young man with acne and terrified eyes, looked at the schematic and then back at her. What about it? You can't see the power relay diagram, she said, her voice a little stronger now. Marcus let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was a cruel sound. Is that so? And what would you know about power relay diagrams? Did you get a degree in electrical engineering from the University of Bleach and Water? The other men snickered. The tension in the room found a welcome release valve, her. The cleaner. The maid. The nobody. Humiliation burned in Ilara's cheeks, hot and sharp. She felt herself shrink, the invisibility she usually wore as a cloak becoming a shroud. She wanted to turn and run, to disappear back into the service corridors where she belonged. She looked at Croft. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. There was no help there. I apologize, she murmured, her eyes dropping to the floor. I was just. I'll go. Yes, Marcus sneered, puffing out his chest, reasserting his dominance. You do that. Go, clean something. We have actual work to do here. She turned and walked away, the sound of her squeaking shoes echoing her shame. She didn't look back. She fled the room, the sound of their dismissive laughter following her down the hall. She didn't see the flicker of something in Julian Croft's eyes. A brief, questioning curiosity, quickly extinguished by the overwhelming pressure of his crisis. She made it to the janitor's closet on the 44th floor, her sanctuary of solitude. The small, windowless room smelled of ammonia and damp wool. It was her space. Safe. She sank onto an overturned bucket, her body trembling. The shame was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. The arrogance of that man, Marcus. The casual cruelty. It wasn't just that he had dismissed her, he had tried to erase her. To remind her that she was nothing. And for a moment, she believed him. She was a cleaner. A high school graduate with 2 years of a library science degree she never finished. What could she possibly know that 8 of the world's most brilliant technological minds didn't? It was foolish. Arrogant of her to even think it. She buried her face in her hands, the rough, calloused skin of her palms scraping against her cheeks. The smell of industrial soap filled her nostrils. This was her world. This was her reality. She had to accept it. Keep her head down. Collect her meager paycheck. Hope it was enough. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The image of the eviction notice returned. The stark, black letters. Final warning. Leo's face. The way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. The knot in her stomach tightened. It wasn't just shame anymore. It was anger. A cold, quiet rage that began to burn away the humiliation. They were wrong. She stood up and began to pace the tiny closet. 3 steps one way, 3 steps back. Her mind, free from the pressure of their scornful eyes, began to work. It began to assemble the data. Fact 1, the problem is a cascade failure originating from Rack 7. The experts agree on this. Fact 2, Rack 7 is running abnormally hot. She had felt it. The others, standing 20 feet away staring at screens, had not. Fact 3, there is a specific, repeating, high-pitched noise coming from Rack 7. Squeak squeak. Squeak. A fan, most likely. A fan struggling to cool an overheating component. A fan failing. Fact 4, the dust settlement is heavier on one side of the rack. This indicates an uneven airflow. Something is blocking the ventilation. Fact 5, the sticky residue on the floor. Sugar. Old. Weeks old. It was near the rear ventilation intake at the base of the rack. Fact 6, the coffee stain on the schematic, obscuring the power distribution unit. The very unit that would control the power flow and, consequently, the cooling systems for that rack. She stopped pacing. She closed her eyes. The story played out in her mind, clear and logical as a perfectly catalogued archive. Weeks ago, someone, a technician, a careless executive on a tour, spilled a sugary drink near Rack 7. A janitor did a poor job of cleaning it up, leaving a sticky residue on the floor and, more importantly, on the fine mesh of the lower ventilation intake. Over time, that sticky mesh became a magnet for dust. The airflow was slowly, progressively choked off. The components inside began to run hotter. The primary cooling fan for a specific critical processor, the one controlling the data indexing, the card catalog for the entire array, began to work overtime. It started to fail, the bearings wearing out, causing the high-pitched squeal she'd heard. The squeal wasn't random. It was the sound of the fan spinning up, failing, stopping, and starting again as the component's temperature fluctuated over a critical threshold. The processor would overheat. When it did, it would throw a data error, a tiny blip of corruption. The system, designed for perfection, would try to correct it. But the overheating was persistent. The errors compounded. It wasn't one big failure. It was a million tiny ones, a death by 1,000 cuts. A slow, creeping corruption that mimicked a software bug but was, in its heart, a purely physical problem. The cold boots the experts were trying weren't working because as soon as the system powered on, the processor would immediately overheat again, and the whole cycle of corruption would start over before the boot sequence could even complete. It was a vicious, physical loop. The solution wasn't in the code. It was in the dust. It was so simple. So elegant. So obvious, if you were looking at the whole system, the physical reality, and not just the digital abstraction on a screen. Ilara opened her eyes. The closet was dark, but in her mind, a light had been switched on. A brilliant, terrifying light. She knew how to fix it. And now, a choice. She could stay here. She could go home at the end of her shift, clutching her useless paycheck, and watch her brother fade away. She could let the landlord throw her things onto the street. She could be the invisible woman, the sensible woman who knew her place. Or she could walk back into that room. She could face the sneering face of Marcus Thorne and the cold, unreadable eyes of Julian Croft. She could risk the last thing she had in the world, this job, on the slim, insane chance that they would listen. Terrified resolve settled in her gut. It felt like swallowing ice. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't even just about Leo. It was about the problem. It was broken, and she knew how to fix it. It was a deep, fundamental offense to her orderly mind to leave it broken. It was wrong. She thought of Agnes, the head of housekeeping. Agnes had been with the company for 30 years. She had seen everything. Earlier that week, Agnes had watched Ilara meticulously reorganize the cluttered magazine rack in the executive lounge, arranging them not alphabetically, but by publication date and then subject matter, creating an intuitive, sensible flow. You have a good head on your shoulders, Ilara, Agnes had said, her voice warm. You see the way things are meant to be. Don't ever let anyone tell you that's not a valuable thing. Agnes's words echoed in her mind. A valuable thing. Ilara smoothed down her uniform. She took a deep breath, the smell of bleach filling her lungs, grounding her. She walked out of the janitor's closet and back towards the 44th floor server room. Each step was a hammer blow against her fear. Her squeaking shoes were no longer a sound of shame. They were a drumbeat. A march. She reached the glass door. Inside, the scene was even more desperate. Julian Croft was standing over Marcus, his face a thundercloud. This is your last chance, Marcus, Croft was saying, his voice a low growl. You have 1 hour. Then you, and your entire team of overpaid children, are finished. I will personally see to it that you never work in this city again. Marcus was pale, his bravado gone, replaced by the raw terror of a man watching his life's work evaporate. Ilara pushed the door open. Once again, the room fell silent. Every head turned. This time, the expressions were not of simple irritation, but of pure, baffled disbelief. She was back. Marcus stared at her as if she were a cockroach that had just crawled out of his expensive coffee. What in God's name do you want now? I told you to get out. Ilara ignored him. Her eyes were fixed on Julian Croft. She walked directly towards him, her step steady, her gaze unwavering. The invisible woman was about to make herself seen. She stopped a few feet from him. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and clean, a stark contrast to the room's stench of failure. Mr. Croft, she said. Her voice was not a whisper this time. It was clear, calm, and carried the unnerving weight of absolute certainty. Your experts are wrong. The problem is not the software. Croft stared at her. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air. His first instinct was to have security remove her. But there was something in her eyes, a fierce, focused intelligence he had not seen in any of the so-called experts he was paying a fortune. Go on, he said, the 2 words a quiet command that silenced Marcus, who had been about to erupt. They are looking for a digital ghost, Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength. But the problem is physical. It's a mechanical failure caused by a chain of simple, observable events. She turned and pointed at Rack 7. That rack is overheating. It's been overheating for weeks. One of the junior techs scoffed. The system temps are all in the green. We checked. You checked the system-wide average, Ilara corrected him, not unkindly. You didn't check the microtemperature of the primary indexing controller. Because the sensor for that specific chip failed 3 months ago. It's in the maintenance logs, but no one bothered to replace it. She had seen the logbook left open on a desk during her rounds last week. A line item, ignored. The cooling fan for that controller is also failing, she went on, her confidence growing as she laid out the facts. It's making a noise. A repeating pattern of distress. It can't cope with the heat. Why is it overheating? Croft asked, his eyes narrowed, following her logic. Because the ventilation is compromised, she said, walking towards the back of the rack. She knelt down, her knees pressing into the cold concrete. She pointed to the fine mesh of the air intake. Weeks ago, someone spilled a drink here. It was cleaned, but not properly. The sugar residue made the filter sticky. She ran a finger over the mesh. It came away black with a thick, greasy dust. She held up her finger for them all to see. This is blocking the airflow. Slowly, day by day, it's been getting worse. The controller overheats, it throws a tiny error. The fan sputters. The system cools for a second, then it overheats again. Millions of times. It's created a cascading corruption that looks like a software failure. You can't fix it with a reboot, because the physical problem is still there. A stunned silence filled the room. The 8 experts looked from Ilara's dusty finger to the server rack to their useless screens. They were men who lived in a world of pure data, of elegant code. They had forgotten that their digital world ran on physical things. On metal and plastic and spinning fans and clean air. Marcus finally found his voice, sputtering with indignation. This is insane. She's a janitor. You're not seriously listening to this, are you, Julian? Croft didn't even look at him. His entire focus was on Ilara. How do you fix it? Ilara stood up, wiping her finger on her uniform. First, you need to power down the entire array. Not a reboot. A full, cold shutdown. Let the components cool completely. We can't do that, one of the techs protested. We could lose what little we have left. You have nothing now, Ilara said flatly. You are trying to read a book while the library is on fire. First, you put out the fire. Her simple, powerful metaphor cut through all the technical jargon. Croft nodded slowly. And then, she said, a new, almost imperceptible authority in her voice, you give me a can of compressed air, a pair of tweezers, and a vacuum with a fine nozzle attachment. The request was so bizarre, so low-tech, that for a moment no one moved. Get her what she needs, Croft commanded, his voice iron. A terrified tech scurried away and returned a moment later with the requested items from a toolkit. He handed them to Ilara as if they were holy relics. Shut it down, Croft ordered Marcus. Marcus hesitated, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Julian, this is professional suicide. You committed that an hour ago, Croft said coldly. Now, shut it down, or I will have security escort you from the building and you can watch this from the news van you'll be sleeping in. Defeated, Marcus turned to the console and with a few keystrokes, initiated the full shutdown sequence. One by one, the blinking red lights went dark. The hum of the servers spun down. The frantic energy in the room was replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. The only sound was the faint, wheezing breath of the 8 defeated men. Ilara waited. She didn't look at a clock. She could feel the temperature of the room changing. She placed her hand on the panel of rack 7. Still warm. We need to wait, she said. At least 10 minutes. It has to be completely cold. The 10 minutes that followed were the longest of Julian Croft's life. He stood, arms crossed, watching this woman in a cleaner's uniform who held the fate of his $10 billion company in her hands. He watched her quiet patience, her absolute lack of doubt. She was not guessing. She was not hoping. She knew. He looked at his CTO, Marcus, who was leaning against a wall, his face ashen. He had trusted Marcus. He paid him over $1 million a year to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. And in the end, his $1 million man was being shown up by a woman who probably earned less in a year than Marcus spent on watches. The irony was so bitter it tasted like acid. Finally, Ilara placed her hand on the panel again. She nodded. Okay. She knelt down. With the focus of a surgeon, she used the tweezers to pick away the larger pieces of caked-on dust and debris from the ventilation mesh. Then, she took the can of compressed air and, with short, precise bursts, blew the finer particles loose. Finally, she took the vacuum nozzle and carefully, methodically, cleaned the entire intake until the metal mesh gleamed under the overhead lights. She didn't stop there. She had one of the techs remove the side panel of the rack. She pointed to a small fan, its blades clogged with gray filth. That's the one, she said. She cleaned it, carefully, until it looked new. Then she looked at the processor it was meant to cool. With her finger, she gently nudged a small heat sink attached to the chip. It wobbled. There, she whispered. The heat cycles caused it to expand and contract. It's come loose from the thermal paste. She pressed it down firmly. It clicked back into place. A quiet, terrifyingly simple click. She stood up and handed the tools back to the tech. You can turn it on now. No one moved. They were all staring at her, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. She hadn't used a computer. She hadn't written a single line of code. She had cleaned. Do it, Croft said, his voice hoarse. Marcus, moving like a man in a dream, walked to the console. His fingers trembled as he typed the command to begin the boot sequence. The room held its breath. The servers began to hum, one by one. Green lights began to blink on, replacing the angry red ones. On the main monitor, lines of text scrolled past. Boot protocols. System checks. All normal. Then, the moment of truth. The system reached the point where it had failed before, the mounting of the primary data array. The text paused. Ilara could hear a man behind her start to pray under his breath. And then, new words appeared on the screen. Data array found. Indexing. OK. Mounting /dev/sda1at/data. OK. File system check. OK. A collective gasp went through the room. A wave of relief so powerful it was a physical force. One of the techs started to cry, silent tears of joy and exhaustion rolling down his face. On the screen, the familiar corporate desktop environment appeared. Folders and files, all perfectly intact. The Horizon merger data was there. Everything was there. It was over. Julian Croft did not look at the screen. He looked at Ilara. He looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of awe that had nothing to do with money or power. He was looking at a different kind of power altogether. The power of a mind that saw what no one else could. He walked towards her, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the concrete floor. The 8 experts parted before him like the Red Sea. He stopped in front of her. She didn't flinch. She just met his gaze, her expression calm. Vindicated. Marcus, Croft said, without taking his eyes off Ilara. Yes, Julian. Marcus said, his voice small, broken. Pack your things. A box will be provided. Security will escort you from the building. You have 5 minutes. Marcus's face crumpled. Julian, please. I have a family. I've been with you for 15 years. And in 15 years, you learned nothing, Croft said, his voice devoid of any emotion. The woman who cleans your office for minimum wage just saved this company while you and your team of geniuses stood around and watched it burn. Get out of my sight. Marcus stared at Ilara with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Then, without another word, he turned and stumbled out of the room, a ghost leaving his own haunting. The other 7 experts stood frozen, waiting for the axe to fall on them as well. Croft ignored them. He was still looking at Ilara. What's your name? He asked, his voice softer now. Ilara, she said. Ilara, he repeated, tasting the name. How did you know? I didn't know, she said honestly. I observed. The heat, the dust, the sound. The residue on the floor. The loose heat sink. They were all pieces of a puzzle. Your team was trying to solve the puzzle by only looking at one piece. The elegance of her mind, the poverty of her shoes, he thought, the contrast striking him with the force of a physical blow. He glanced down at her worn sneakers, then back up at her brilliant, tired eyes. I owe you more than I can say, he said. The consulting fee for that cybersecurity firm from Tel Aviv was $200,000, non-refundable. They did nothing. You saved everything. He pulled out his wallet and took out a platinum credit card. Name your price. Any number. I'll have it transferred to your account immediately. Ilara looked at the card, the symbol of a world so far removed from her own. She could ask for $1 million. 10 million. He would pay it. The thought was dizzying. But then she thought of Leo. Of the rent. Of the quiet dignity of work. I don't want a price, she said. I want a solution. Croft raised an eyebrow. A solution. My brother requires a specific medical treatment. The total cost is $53,400. My back rent is $2,600. I need $56,000. She said the number without shame or hesitation. It was a fact. A need. Croft was stunned. He had expected greed. He had expected a lottery winner's fantasy. Instead, he got an invoice. A precise, calculated number based on actual need. That's it, he asked, incredulous. That is what I need, she confirmed. He let out a short, humorless laugh, a sound of pure disbelief. I'll have a check for $100,000 drawn up for you immediately. No, she said, and the word was so firm, so final, that he stopped. I am not a charity case, Mr. Croft. I am not a lottery winner. I am the person who solved your problem. The solution is worth $56,000 to me. That is the amount. Her pride, her sheer, unbending integrity, was more impressive than her intellect. It was the rarest commodity he had ever encountered. "All right," he said, nodding slowly, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time that day. $56,000. But that's not all. He looked around the server room, at the remaining 7 experts who were trying to make themselves as small as possible. "You're all fired," he said to them, his voice casual. They flinched as one. "But," he continued, holding up a hand, "you can all have your jobs back tomorrow. At a 10% pay cut. Your new boss will be deciding if you get to keep them." He turned back to Ilara. "Ilara. I'm offering you a job. Not as a cleaner. I'm creating a new position. Director of Systems and Special Projects. You'll report directly to me. Your only job will be to do exactly what you did today. To see the things that everyone else misses. To find the physical ghosts in my digital machine. Your starting salary will be what I was paying Marcus. $1.2 million a year." Ilara's mind went blank. The number was meaningless. It was a sound, not a concept she could grasp. $12 million. She thought of her gray uniform. The smell of bleach. The ache in her back at the end of a long shift. She looked at Julian Croft, at the genuine offer in his eyes. This wasn't a reward. It was a recognition. He wasn't giving her money, he was giving her a place. A value. I don't have a degree," she stammered, the old insecurities rushing back. "You have something far more valuable," he said softly. "You have perspective. I can hire 100 people with degrees. I can't hire a single person who can do what you just did. Will you accept?" She took a deep breath. She thought of Leo getting his treatment. She thought of never having to worry about rent again. She thought of Agnes's kind words. "You see the way things are meant to be." She looked Julian Croft in the eye. The powerful, blind men who could finally see. "Yes," she said. "I accept." 6 months later. The sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corner office on the 45th floor. The office next to Julian Croft's. The air smelled not of bleach, but of old paper, new leather, and the faint, pleasant aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Ilara stood looking out over the city, a sprawling map of concrete and glass. She wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, the fabric soft against her skin. Her hair was still pulled back, but now it was in a sleek, professional chignon. On her feet were a pair of elegant, comfortable Italian leather shoes. She was no longer invisible. When she walked down the halls, people met her eyes. They said, "Good morning, Director," not with fear, but with a genuine respect she had earned over the last 6 months. Her first week had been a trial by fire. The remaining IT team had been resentful, hostile. They had tried to trip her up with jargon, to bury her in technical data she couldn't possibly understand. It hadn't worked. She hadn't tried to be one of them. She had listened. She had observed. She had walked through their data centers and supply closets. She had found a multi-million-dollar inventory discrepancy not by looking at the spreadsheets, but by noticing that the boxes for the new fiber optic cables were 6 inches smaller than the old ones, and no one had adjusted the warehouse shelving to match. Thousands of units had been misplaced behind other equipment. She had solved a recurring network outage in the Tokyo office by cross-referencing the outage schedule with the local sanitation department's street sweeping schedule. The vibrations from the heavy machines were periodically jiggling a loose connection in a junction box under the sidewalk. She saw the patterns everyone else missed. She was the company's ghost hunter. And she was terrifyingly good at it. The door to her office opened and Julian Croft walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. He placed one on her desk. "Good morning, Ilara," he said. His voice, once a weapon, was now often gentle when he spoke to her. "Good morning, Julian," she replied, turning from the window. Their relationship had evolved. It was no longer just employer and employee. They were partners. They worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared, obsessive drive to solve problems. He had discovered the sharp, incisive wit that lay beneath her quiet exterior. She had discovered the surprising vulnerability beneath his armor of power. He admired her mind. She respected his vision. And somewhere in between, a fragile, unspoken affection had begun to grow. The board approved the funding for the library initiative, he said, leaning against her desk. All of it, she asked, her eyes lighting up. Every penny, he confirmed. The Elara Vance Public Library Literacy Program is officially a go, he used her full name. Vance. A name he'd learned from her employment file, a name she was rebuilding. It had been her idea. A massive corporate grant to underfunded public libraries across the state, focused on archival sciences and information access for low-income communities. It was her way of giving back. Of making sure another Elara Vance wouldn't have to abandon her dreams. Her brother, Leo, was responding well to the treatment. He was regaining strength. The hope was back in his eyes. Elara had moved him into a spacious, accessible apartment in a good building, with a full-time nurse. She visited him every other day. They talked for hours, laughing more than they had in years. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. Julian watched her, a soft expression on his face. I have the preliminary prospectus for the Aerodyne acquisition. It's a mess. The numbers don't add up. Finance, legal, none of them can figure out what's wrong. They say the company looks perfect on paper, but their gut tells them something is off. He slid a thick binder across the desk. I was hoping you'd take a look. Elara picked up the binder. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. Old paper and new ink. An unsolved puzzle. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the first page, a summary of corporate assets. Factories, patents, supply chains. She smiled faintly. I'll need a new pair of shoes, she said. Julian laughed, a real, genuine laugh. And why is that? Because I think I need to go walk through one of their warehouses, she said. I have a feeling the answer isn't in this binder. It's in the dust. He looked at her, this brilliant, beautiful woman who had walked out of the shadows and into the center of his world. This invisible genius who had fixed his server, and in doing so, had fixed him. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he would follow her into any dusty warehouse, into any forgotten corner of the world, just to watch her mind at work. In her new, expensive wallet, nestled next to a company credit card with no limit, Elara still kept one thing from her old life. A worn, frayed public library card with her name on it. A reminder of where she came from. A reminder that the most valuable things are often the ones no one else sees. She was not invisible anymore. And she was just getting started.